Brando walked onto the Tonight Show stage on May 11th, 1968, and did something nobody in Hollywood had ever seen him do before. He sat down across from Johnny Carson, leaned forward in the guest chair, and began to cry. Not the controlled, technical crying of an actor working a scene, something rawer than that. Something that made the studio audience go absolutely still, made Doc Severinsen lower his trumpet mid-note, made Ed McMahon forget whatever wisecrack was forming on his lips. This was a man coming apart in real time. And what broke Marlon Brando that night had nothing to do with acting, nothing to do with his complicated reputation in Hollywood, nothing to do with the legendary difficulties directors whispered about behind closed doors. It was something else entirely, something he had never told a single person on Earth. A letter. A handwritten letter folded into quarters, pressed into the chest pocket of his dark jacket, sitting directly against his heart. A letter from a man named James Baldwin. A letter written 48 hours before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. A letter that predicted, with terrifying precision, exactly what was about to happen to America. And the reason Brando was crying was not grief, though grief was certainly part of it. He was crying because the letter contained a question Baldwin had asked him directly, a question nobody in that studio understood yet, a question that would change the entire trajectory of Marlon Brando's life from that night forward. Johnny Carson had no idea what was coming. He thought this was going to be a standard celebrity interview. It was anything but. Wait, if this story already has something tightening in your chest, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Because what unfolds in the next few minutes will change how you see both of these men forever. To understand what happened on that stage, you need to understand what the spring of 1968 had already done to the country, and what it had specifically done to Marlon Brando. And to understand that, you need to go back even further, to a man and a friendship that most of America had never been told about. The show was taped on May 11th at NBC Studios in Burbank, California, recorded in the late afternoon for broadcast that same night. But the world Brando drove through to reach that studio was barely recognizable. Martin Luther King Jr. had been murdered in Memphis 37 days earlier, on April 4th. Robert Kennedy would be shot dead in Los Angeles just 25 days after this taping. America felt like a country consuming itself from the inside, and Marlon Brando, who by 1968 was widely considered the greatest actor alive and simultaneously the most professionally difficult man in Hollywood, had been doing something that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. He had been marching. He had been organizing. He had driven to Memphis the week after King's assassination and walked alongside the sanitation workers whose strike King had come to support when he was killed. He had appeared at rallies. He had put his name and his face and his enormous cultural capital directly behind the civil rights movement in a way that made studio executives nervous and made certain corners of America furious. None of this was performance. None of it was publicity. His managers begged him to be careful. His agent warned him he was alienating half his potential audience. Brando had a one-word response to all of it, and it is not a word you can say on television. But the thing driving him, the thing none of the reporters or studio executives or worried managers understood, was the letter. A letter that was sitting in his jacket pocket right now as he stepped behind the curtain at NBC Burbank and waited for Ed McMahon to call his name. Johnny Carson was in his dressing room 30 minutes before taping, reviewing his notes. His producer knocked twice and entered without being invited, which meant something was wrong. "Johnny," the producer said, "Brando's here. He's been in the green room for an hour." "He looks," the producer paused, searching for the right word. "He looks like a man who's already decided something." Johnny looked up from his note cards. "Decided what?" The producer shook his head. "I don't know. But he asked me to tell you something before the show," he said. "Tell Carson I'm not here to talk about acting tonight." Johnny set his note cards down. He had interviewed thousands of people. He had a talent, almost supernatural, for reading what was really happening beneath the surface of a conversation. And what his producer was describing, that specific quality of a person who has already decided something, that was the most dangerous kind of guest. Not dangerous in any threatening sense. Dangerous in the sense that when someone has already crossed a private bridge inside themselves, when they have already decided they are going to say the true thing regardless of consequence, you cannot steer them. You cannot redirect them. All you can do is be present enough to catch what falls. Johnny walked down to the green room himself, something he rarely did before a taping. He knocked and opened the door. Brando was sitting in a leather chair in the corner, still wearing his street clothes, a dark jacket over a black turtleneck, his large hands resting on his knees. He looked up when Johnny entered. For a moment, neither man spoke. Johnny had known Brando casually for years, the way everyone in Hollywood knew everyone else. A handshake at a party, a mutual acquaintance, a shared space at industry events. But he had never sat alone in a room with him. What he noticed immediately was that Brando's eyes looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You asked to see me," Johnny said. Brando nodded slowly. "I need you to know something before we go out there." "What's that?" Brando reached into his jacket pocket, touched the folded letter briefly, then withdrew his hand. He looked at Johnny with an expression that would be very hard to describe. It was not sadness exactly. It was something closer to urgency. A man who has been carrying weight for too long and has finally decided the carrying is finished. "I'm going to say some things tonight," Brando said quietly, "that I've never said in public. I need you to let me say them. Don't pull me back toward the funny stories. Or don't ask me about The Godfather or the next picture." He paused. "There's something more important than any of that, and I am running out of time to say it." Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. "You have the floor. Whatever you need." That was all Brando needed to hear. But what Johnny still didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was what was actually in the letter. And that letter was about to shatter every assumption everyone in the studio held about who Marlon Brando really was. Stay with me, because the next part is where everything changes. The show began at 5:30 in the afternoon exactly, taped for broadcast at 11:30 that same night. Johnny's monologue was sharp, political, referencing Vietnam and the widening chaos in American cities that spring. The audience laughed, but underneath the laughter was the particular tension of an audience that had been living inside an ongoing national emergency for 2 months and was simultaneously exhausted by it and unable to stop paying attention to it. Ed McMahon's introduction of the first guest was straightforward and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest actors in the history of American cinema. Please welcome Marlon Brando." The applause was enormous. This was a studio audience in 1968, welcoming a genuine cultural titan. On screen, his performances in A Streetcar, named Desire, and On the Waterfront, had redefined what film acting could be. The audience cheered the way people cheer when someone walks into a room who they have spent their whole lives watching from a distance and cannot quite believe is real. So Brando came through the curtain in his dark jacket and black turtleneck, moving with that quality he had always carried, a kind of physical gravity, as though the air itself organized slightly differently around him. He was 44 years old. His face had thickened from the sharp-planed beauty of his early career, but there was something in how he held himself that was immediately arresting. He settled into the guest chair and looked at Johnny, and the look was direct and unguarded in a way that made the nearest camera operator instinctively tighten the frame. For the first 10 minutes, the interview moved along expected lines. Johnny asked about his work. Brando answered briefly, not dismissively, but with the air of someone in a waiting room who knows they have somewhere more important to be. He was polite. He was even, at moments, funny. But something else was happening underneath. Something the studio audience could feel without being able to name. He kept touching his jacket pocket. Just briefly, just the fingertips pressing once against the fabric over his chest. Then his hand would return to his knee. Johnny noticed it on the third time it happened. His eyes tracked the gesture, then moved back to Brando's face. And that was the moment Johnny Carson made the decision that changed the entire night. He set his note cards down on the desk and left them there. He was done with the prepared questions. Whatever was in that pocket was the real interview. "Marlon," Johnny said, and his voice shifted from host warmth to something quieter and more genuine. "What are you actually here to talk about tonight?" The studio went very still. Brando looked at Johnny for a moment without answering. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the letter. He held it in both hands, looking down at it, and when he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "I want to talk about James Baldwin," he said. The audience made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. Something in between, a collective intake. Johnny leaned forward slightly. "Tell me." Brando unfolded the letter slowly, as though each crease were something he had been over many times before. He did not read from it immediately. He just held it open in his lap and looked at it the way you look at something that has permanently reorganized your interior geography. "I met Baldwin years ago," Brando began, his voice lower now than it had been during the lighter portion of the interview. "We became friends. Our real friends. Not the Hollywood version where you see someone at a party 4 times and call them a friend. He actually knew me." Brando stopped, and for a moment the word he was searching for seemed genuinely unavailable to him. He was one of the only people in my entire life who ever looked directly at me and refused to see the performance. Johnny said nothing. He understood that what was required right now was not a question. It was stillness. Brando continued. "About a week before Dr. King was killed, Jimmy sent me this letter. He had been in Memphis. He knew what was building. He had a feeling about what was going to happen, the kind of feeling that people who have been watching violence move through a country for a long time develop, a terrible accuracy about where it is heading." Brando's voice had steadied, but his hands had not. The paper trembled slightly in his grip. He wrote me about America, what he believed was happening to it, what he believed was going to keep happening to it unless something fundamental changed. And then at the end, he asked me a question. He looked up at Johnny. He asked me what I was willing to lose. Johnny Carson, who had spent 15 years learning to hold a conversation steady under any circumstances, felt something shift in his chest. What did he mean by that? Brando set the letter down on his knee and looked out at the audience for a moment, and the expression on his face was one that had no equivalent in any of his film performances because it was not a performance at all. He meant exactly what he asked, Brando said. He was asking me, specifically me, a man with everything, one with money and fame and the ability to walk into any room in any country on earth and be recognized and deferred to. He was asking me what I was willing to actually give up. Not donate, not show up for. Give up. Lose. Permanently. He paused, and I had to sit with that question for a long time before I understood what he was really asking. Because the honest answer, when I first read it, was nothing. I wasn't willing to lose anything. I had marched. I had made speeches. I had shown up. But I had gone home afterward. I had gone back to my house and my career and my name. Brando's voice broke on the last word. He pressed his lips together and looked down at the letter. The studio was completely silent. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seat. Johnny Carson had his hands folded on his desk, and he was watching Brando with an attention that had nothing professional in it anymore. This is where what happened next needs to be understood for what it was. This was not a celebrity having a moment. This was not a famous person performing vulnerability for a camera. This was a man in the middle of a genuine reckoning, doing it in public, in real time, because James Baldwin had asked him a question he could not answer privately anymore. Subscribe right now if you want to see how this ends, because what Brando says in the next 2 minutes is something that was never planned, never scripted, and never forgotten by a single person who heard it. Drop your location in the comments. You are going to want to remember where you were when you first heard this. Brando set the letter on Johnny's desk. It was a gesture so deliberate that it created a small, audible stir in the audience. He was not reading from it. He was setting it down, putting it somewhere visible, somewhere the camera could hold. He looked at Johnny, and then he looked at the audience with a directness that made several people in the front rows physically straighten in their seats. "I grew up in Nebraska," Brando said. "Middle of the country, middle of the last century. And the story I absorbed about America, the story almost every white child in this country absorbs, is that the problems are always somewhere else, always in the past, always being handled by someone more qualified, always almost fixed." He paused. Jimmy spent 30 years telling us that was a lie, and we applauded him for saying it, and then we went back to believing the lie because it is the most comfortable thing in the world to believe. His voice was steady now. The tears that had threatened earlier had not fallen. Something else had taken their place, a quality of fierce, exhausted clarity. "The only honest response to what has happened to this country," Brando continued, and his voice dropped to something almost conversational, "the way very serious things are sometimes most devastating. When they are said quietly, the only honest response is to ask yourself, what part of the comfort you are living inside is built on someone else's pain? And then to answer that question honestly, without the performance, without the applause at the end." Johnny Carson was very still. He said, very quietly, "Did you answer it?" Brando looked at him. "I'm trying." He picked the letter back up. He folded it along its original creases and held it for a moment. Then he looked up at Johnny again. "Jimmy wrote something else at the end of this letter." He said, "Marlon, the camera loves you. America loves you. Use it. Not for the next picture. Use it for what matters while you still have the time and the platform to matter. Use it before it's too late." The studio held its breath. Johnny said nothing for a full 3 seconds, which on live television is not a pause. It is an event. Then he said, very simply, "What are you going to do?" And Brando smiled. It was a tired smile, an honest smile, nothing behind it but the actual answer. "Everything I can," he said, "whatever that costs." Johnny nodded slowly. He reached across the desk and picked up the letter. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Then he set it gently back on Brando's side of the desk. He said, "Tell me about James Baldwin. Tell me who he is, for the people watching who only know the name." And Brando told them. For the next 20 minutes, Marlon Brando, the most famous actor in the world, did not talk about himself at all. He talked about his friend. He talked about the precision of Baldwin's mind, about the way Baldwin could hold 2 entirely contradictory truths in the same sentence without resolving the tension between them because, as Baldwin believed, the tension was the point. He talked about a dinner they'd had years earlier where Baldwin had said something Brando had written down and kept. "The not yet free man does not yet know what freedom is. Only that it matters more than safety." He talked about the nights they had sat in rooms together, while the country outside the window made decisions about whose life was worth grieving and whose was not. And as he talked, something happened in that studio that the crew members who were there would describe for years afterward. The audience stopped being an audience. The people sitting in those seats stopped being spectators and became something else, Witnesses, maybe, or participants, or simply people who understood for a few minutes that what was happening in front of them was not television in the usual sense. It was a man choosing, in public, to be fully accountable to a question another man had asked him, and that choice was more compelling than anything a script could have constructed. But here is what nobody in that studio knew yet, and what happened after the cameras stopped rolling that night would remain a private story for decades, known only to a handful of people. The moment the taping ended, Brando did not leave the stage immediately. He sat in the guest chair while the crew began breaking down their positions around him, and he looked at Johnny, who had not moved from behind his desk, and he said something quietly enough that the cameras could no longer capture it. He said, "I don't know if I did that right." Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's no right way to tell the truth. You just have to tell it." Brando nodded. He folded the letter one final time and put it back in his pocket. Then he stood, extended his hand across the desk, and shook Johnny's hand. In the way you shake the hand of someone you have just gone through something real with. Johnny said, "Come back when you have more to say." Brando said, "I will." He did. He returned to The Tonight Show multiple times over the following years, and every conversation had a quality that was different from his appearances elsewhere, more direct, less defended, more willing to follow a question into territory that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Johnny Carson always said Brando was the hardest interview he ever conducted, not because Brando was difficult, but because he refused to let the conversation be about anything other than what it was actually about. "You cannot hide from someone who has already decided they are done hiding," Johnny told a producer years later. And that night in 1968, Marlon Brando had decided. "Most guests come on this show to be seen," Johnny said years later. Brando came to see. "There is a difference that matters more than almost anything I can name. To be seen is to use the camera as a mirror. To come to see is to use it as a window." Every night for 30 years, Johnny had watched guests arrive at that desk and direct everything outward, toward the audience, toward the ratings, toward the version of themselves they needed America to hold. Brando had come in and turned the camera around. He had pointed it at something the studio audience had not expected to be looking at. And in doing so, he had made everyone in that building, and everyone watching from home, aware of themselves in a way that a normal interview never achieves. The broadcast aired at 11:30 that evening. The reaction was unlike anything NBC's switchboard had handled in years. Calls came in from across the country, from people who said they had never heard a famous person speak that way on television, without distance, without the protective glass of celebrity between themselves and the subject they were addressing. Some calls were angry. A number of sponsors sent concerned telegrams to the network, and a great many people called simply to say that they had been watching from their living rooms and something had shifted, quietly, in how they were going to think about things going forward. James Baldwin watched the broadcast in New York. He called Brando the next morning. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Neither man ever fully disclosed what was said, but the people around both of them in the days that followed noted something unmistakable. Baldwin seemed less tired, as though some long-held tension had finally been released. And Brando seemed less alone, as though he had set down a weight he had been carrying in private for too long, and found that the setting down had not destroyed him. The letter stayed with Brando for the rest of his life. When he died in 2004, his family found it among the few personal documents he had kept close. It was folded along its original creases, worn at the edges from years of being taken out and put back. The people who knew him said he never talked much about that Tonight Show appearance. He didn't need to. What he had said, he had meant entirely. And the saying of it had cost him, as Baldwin had asked it would, something real. Several projects he might have had evaporated after that broadcast. A portion of Hollywood never quite forgave him for using the guest chair as a place for something other than promotion. And he didn't appear to notice, Or if he noticed, he didn't appear to mind. Because the alternative, sitting across from Johnny Carson on a night when America was tearing apart, and using that chair to talk about his next picture, that alternative had become genuinely unimaginable to him. What Jimmy had asked had made it unimaginable. And that, Brando said once, years later, in a private conversation that was later recounted by someone who had been present, that is the only thing a great question can really do for you. It closes off the easier road. So you have no choice but to walk down the harder one. Johnny Carson never forgot that night either. He spoke about it rarely, but when he did, he said something that stayed with the people who heard it. Most guests come on this show to be seen, he said. Brando came to see. There's a difference, and a difference that matters more than almost anything I can name. And the thing about a person who has decided to truly see, who has folded up the performance and put it away for the evening, is that everyone in the room can feel it. The audience felt it. The crew felt it. 30 million people watching from their homes that night felt it. That is not acting. That is something older and harder and more necessary than acting. That is a man using the only platform he had to say the only thing that felt true. The Tonight Show stage at NBC Burbank, the pale desk, the modest potted plant visible in the corner of the frame, the microphone stand between the two chairs, the black turtleneck against the dark jacket, a letter in a chest pocket, a question written 48 hours before an assassination, and one man's decision. I'm at 44 years old, in the middle of the most fractured spring America had known in a century, to finally, publicly, answer it honestly. That is what happened on May 11th, 1968, in Studio One at NBC Burbank. That is who Marlon Brando was, when the camera was running and the performance was finished, and there was nothing left between the man and the moment but the truth. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you the moments behind the moments, the conversations that mattered more than the credits, the nights that changed people in ways no award could measure. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the most powerful thing any of us can do is refuse to look away. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me where in the world you heard this story for the first time. And remember what Baldwin asked, and what Brando answered in front of 30 million people on a May night, when the country needed someone to be honest, more than it needed someone to be entertaining. What are you willing to lose? Because the answer to that question is the only honest measure of what you actually believe. Go find out your answer. Today.